Hello, everyone. Welcome to another brief lecture for our Phil 115 critical thinking material. This is chapter 10, Inference to the Best Explanation. And really, chapter 10 is a culmination of our examination of inductive reasoning. Inference to the best explanation is used every day in many different facets of our lives. As you can see here on the screen, we use this kind of reasoning when we're trying to figure out what's wrong with our car, when we're trying to figure out things like, who or what caused the broken glass in our freezer, for example. Medical reasoning, we use this all the time. And I think it's very fitting to have this be one of our last chapters because it really is, I think, safe to say, the most commonly used form of inductive reasoning that we use in everyday life. So it occupies, importantly, a central role in how we reason in everyday contexts. Now, of course, we don't always get these kinds of explanations correct. We often misdiagnose people. Car mechanics can misdiagnose what's wrong with our car. We can attribute a cause to something that's not the appropriate cause, as we saw a little bit in our chapter on Mill's methods. But nonetheless, it's certainly important to talk about inference to best explanation and its role in conspiracy theories, which increasingly and unfortunately has become a major part of American discourse. And so it's also, I think, very fitting to talk about conspiracy theories in tandem with chapter 10. So I'll hit some of the highlights of the chapter here, but we'll also keep the idea of conspiracy theories in the foreground as we go through this chapter. So more specifically, with reference to inference to the best explanation, as I said, this is a form of inductive reasoning. More specifically, it's the kind of reasoning in which we reason from premises about a state of affairs to an explanation for that state of affairs. So it typically has the argument structure as follows. We have some phenomenon that we want to explain. We have another premise where we assert that some evidence, call it E, provides the best explanation for Q. And then we conclude or infer that therefore it's probable that E is true. And as I mentioned, it's really quite commonly used in everyday contexts, scientific medical practice. Also, I forgot to mention legal context when we're trying to find whether someone is guilty of a crime, and also in conjunction with causal arguments when we're trying to figure out what the cause of something is. So a little bit of overlap, but inference to best explanation, or IBE, is certainly used quite commonly. Okay, so here's an example that I kind of referenced a few moments ago. This has happened to me. I don't know if it's happened to you, but certainly I've left bottles in the freezer. So if I open up the freezer in my house and I notice that there's shards of glass everywhere, I am going to try to determine what the best explanation for that phenomenon is, right? So I notice that there are shards of glass scattered in the freezer, but I know that, or maybe somebody else in my house knows that I love sparkling cider. And let's say that you saw me going wild last night with multiple bottles, right? Non-alcoholic. And later I crashed from the sugar high near the freezer. So what's the best explanation for why we're seeing shards of glass? I mean, this is a simple example, but it highlights the kind of reasoning that IBE is known for, which is the best explanation is that I left a bottle of sparkling cider in the freezer, and from the pressure, it exploded. Now, we're pretty certain about this explanation, but we should point out here that obviously examples get more complicated. Also, I mean, it is theoretically possible that somebody else in my home, or a friend or a family member, tried to frame me. So they opened up my freezer and smashed a bottle. That's possible. Is that likely? No, not really. But given this evidence that we see here in P2, and given what we see here in P1, we think the best explanation for why there's shards of glass is that I left a bottle of sparkling cider in the freezer and it exploded. That's the best explanation. Is it the only explanation? No, but we think it's the best given what other background information we have and empirical evidence we have at our disposal. So I'm guessing you could think of your own example. It could be from something simple like leaving your car lights on, right, and your battery drained, to a medical issue, right? We use IBE there as well. Doctors and nurses use it every day. So you can hopefully think of your own example of IBE from personal experience that maybe has even occurred recently. Okay, so just to emphasize what IBE is, we think that the explanation is a claim, right? Because arguments are composed of statements or claims, and it's a claim about why the state of affairs is the way that it is. So the key question that this type of inference or piece of reasoning tries to answer is, again, what is the best explanation for the existence or nature of this state of affairs? And we think that the best explanation is the one most likely to be true, even though there's no guarantee of its truth, as there is in deductive inference and reasoning, because remember, this IBE is inductive reasoning because it doesn't guarantee that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true, but we think we try to get that right, just like with any kind of inductive reasoning. The more evidence, the better. And it's not a guarantee like deductive reasoning gives us, but we still think that it's a pretty reliable process over the long run. So let's go back to an example I just mentioned a moment ago. Let's just to really be thorough here. Let's say your car won't start in the morning as you're getting ready to go to the grocery store or school or something. What are the possible explanations? Well, the battery's dead, the fuel tank is empty, the starter has malfunctioned, a vandal has sabotaged the engine. All or several of these, right? I mean, seems less likely, but it's possible. We naturally start eliminating some of the choices given the evidence. Maybe we land on theory 2 or explanation 1. Then we could give an argument for the theory that best fits. So actually, sorry, I think this page reference is to the previous edition, so I need to fix that. I think this is in 2 something. I think it's right at the beginning of the chapter. So I want to say it's 205. Sorry for this mistype here. So it's safe to assume that IBE is important because of how natural it is. I mean, maybe this has happened to you and you've landed on, you start eliminating, let's say 2, because you know that yesterday you filled up your tank, so it can't be 2. And you don't think that it's 4 because there's no evidence of that, right? So we start doing this. This shows the kind of reasoning that we use in conjunction with IBE. We could even consider additional possibilities if we really wanted to be thorough. I mean, if you're like me, you know somebody who sleepwalks, and it is pretty interesting what people do when they sleepwalk. It can obviously be very dangerous, but I mean, it's, I guess, theoretically possible if you know a sleepwalker that they could have sabotaged your car. Maybe a family member, again, is messing with you. Or then maybe you start getting conspiratorial about why your car won't start. You think a poltergeist is messing with you. And then maybe you really get conspiratorial. If you're like me, you like the show Rick and Morty, very philosophical. It's a cartoon. I think it's on Hulu, if I'm not mistaken. So obviously this can get pretty elaborate. And given the examples that we can think of, and even the ones in the conspiracy theories video, people start postulating all kinds of explanations for things. So hopefully you're starting, again, to think about the genesis of conspiracy theories in reference to inference to best explanation. Okay, so obviously we don't want to rule everything or anything out right off the bat. I mean, if it's physically possible, then it is a possible explanation. And we do know from the history of science that weird theories may turn out to be true. So I think good examples would be the development of quantum mechanics, special relativity. You cannot dismiss an explanation merely because it seems far-fetched. But one thing that I really like about our textbook is that Vaughan goes through, well, how do we separate what kind of tools do we have in science, in law, in medicine, philosophy? How do we how do we rule out, 8, but keep these explanations, right? Why are these kinds of explanations for why your car won't start better than the Rick and Morty explanation? Well, I do think that Vaughn, our textbook author, is onto something when he starts talking about the criteria of adequacy. And this is a set of tools that we use. It's not foolproof. It's not like we always go through it like a checklist, but I do think it captures the essence of why we prefer certain explanations over others, and why those procedures are much more reliable and lead us to more plausible explanations than these kinds of things. Okay, so the criteria of adequacy gives us a set of tools, as I mentioned, we can use to assess eligible and competing theories for a given explanation. The criteria provide essential tools often invoked in scientific, medical, and legal reasoning, and in everyday contexts as well. So applying the criteria of adequacy to a set of theories constitutes the ultimate test of a theory's value. For, we want to say, the best theory is the eligible theory that meets the criteria of adequacy better than its competitors. Okay, whoops, sorry. Yeah. So this is especially valuable when we're, again, evaluating multiple possible explanations. So this could be in reference to, again, a scientific example, a medical example, a legal example, your car not starting. And the key takeaway here is that with the process of elimination, we think that there's a reason that your battery is dead is a more plausible explanation because it meets these criteria. And because of certain facts and evidence, we think we have more reason to accept those explanations than the Rick and Morty explanation. It fits best with the evidence. So here are the criteria that is in our textbook. Consistency. Let's start with consistency. So that's a bust of Aristotle. And one thing that certainly relates to conspiracy theories is this discussion of internal and external consistency. So a theory or explanation is internally consistent when it is free of contradictions. What does that mean? Well, that means any explanation or theory shouldn't contradict itself, right? If the theory says that both the sky is blue and the sky is not blue, that's not internally consistent, right? We want theories that don't say one thing and the other thing that don't fit with itself. So a good example of a view that might not be internally consistent would be something like the Flat Earth Society view. So if you're familiar with that view, there's a Netflix thing on this that I can post. If your view says that both the Earth is round in some cases, or the Earth is round, or should be thought, other planets should be thought of as round, but the Earth isn't round, that's a weird inconsistency, right? That has to do with that view. And typically we think consistency matters. It's not foolproof, but any scientific view or medical view should be consistent with itself and externally consistent. It should be consistent with the data it's supposed to explain. So in the book, I think there's an example of a broken car window. So whatever explanation you're going to come up with should be consistent with the external facts on the ground, right? For why the window is broken. So I think one of the possible explanations was completely not plausible because I think, there's blood on the steering wheel. And let's say someone tried to explain it by saying someone threw a brick through your windshield. Well, that's not consistent with the external fact that there's blood on the windshield, right? So that gives more credence to the explanation that somebody broke your window and then crawled through the glass to get to your steering wheel, right? So we want any theory or explanation to be both internally and externally consistent, ideally. This is the great 20th century British philosopher Karl Popper. He was very influential in philosophy of science and logic. We want to point out, though, that the amount or degree of evidence that a theory has cannot be the sole criterion by which we assess explanations, because we've seen in the history of science that even theories or explanations that we never fully adopted, we can confirm those quite easily. So maybe we need something more than just evidence, because it's often easy, Popper would say, to find evidence to confirm your theory, right? Confirmation bias. So it can't be the only criterion. It's certainly an important one, but it can't be the sole criterion, because we can come up with a number of theories or a number of pieces of confirming evidence. Okay, so this is where the Flat Earth Society can come in and serve as a very good example. So I would encourage you to just do a quick search. If you don't know about this society, good for you. It's certainly become a lot more prominent, with some celebrities even invoking it. Do a quick Google search for the Flat Earth Society's official page, facts page, where they come up with a list of common questions and answers. And I think it would really illustrate nicely the kind of criteria that we're talking about, because of consistency in particular. So there's a couple places on the page. I wish I could put it here during the lecture, but I can't. We could notice a couple of consistency issues with their facts page, and this is something I normally do in class, but I'd encourage you to go there and check it out for yourself. And you'll notice some consistency issues that come up, both internal consistency and external consistency issues. Okay, so maybe this criteria of adequacy also reminds you of something we all learned about in school, or at least most of us did, the so-called scientific method, and why we like it. I mean, it's not foolproof. It's often taught it might be altered slightly depending on who's teaching it, but there's general common patterns and things that we really like. So one thing that we like about the scientific method, and that relates to this criteria of adequacy, is testability, right? Is there some way to determine if a theory is true? We typically don't place much credence in theories or explanations that you can't test, right? This is why we like the scientific method, because we can test our hypotheses. Also, fruitfulness. We use this talking about scientific views all the time. Does the explanation or theory make a number of novel predictions, right? This is why we like physics and chemistry and biology, because we can make predictions about how things will occur given the theory. We tend to like views that are fruitful. What about the scope? Can it explain a diverse amount of phenomena? We tend to place more credence in theories and explanations that have a wider scope than a much more narrow scope. And this is, again, something that connects with conspiracy theories. This is certainly something that connects with conspiracy theories. Simplicity. Maybe you've heard of something like Occam's razor, which is something along the lines of we should prefer simpler explanations to more complex ones. Conspiracy theories generally are not very simple. They're very complex. They make a lot of assumptions, whereas we tend to prefer simpler explanations, like the car not starting example. The battery is dead is a much simpler explanation, and I have to make far fewer assumptions than I would if I'm trying to explain it as being sucked in the Rick and Morty example, right? That a whole host of assumptions would have to be made for that explanation to be plausible. And conservatism, also related to conspiracy theories. How well does this explanation or theory fit with knowledge we already have, right? So if we're trying to posit something that flies in the face of physics and chemistry and our laws of nature, that's not going to fit very well, right? I mean, we would really have to make a number of not just complicated assumptions, but it would fly in the face of everything we know about how things work. So we tend to prefer much more conservative explanations for phenomena than otherwise. Okay, so just to, again, to rephrase these five, testability. So this is a screenshot of the Ghost Hunters show. I like this because they make it seem like what they're doing is completely scientific. They're walking around with a bunch of devices. That's a very useful ploy that all kinds of people use to make it seem more legitimate than it really is. So they have all these meters out that are measuring who knows what. But at the end of the day, any theory should be testable, right? If it's if it's going to be a plausible explanation. So a theory is testable if it predicts something other than what it was introduced to explain. So another reason I'm picking on the ghost hunter people is because they often use these things to say to come up with circular pieces of evidence. Like, here's my ghost meter and it's off the charts. Okay, well, what is your ghost meter testing for? Ghosts, right? Well, that's a circular form of testing, right? You need to say independently why this is a legitimate test of ghost particles. What is the meaning of ghost particles, and how is this device independently testing for those, right? That's something that we need to understand if we're going to give these kinds of devices or these kinds of tests any credit at all. Again, fruitfulness. So whether the theory yields new insights that can open up whole new areas of research and discovery. This is Rosalind Franklin. She was a chemist at Cambridge, and she had her work somewhat plagiarized from two other male scientists who took all the credit for discovering the double helix structure of DNA. And she wasn't recognized for her contributions until much later, after she died. But she opened up new areas of research, right? DNA, our understanding of DNA has opened up all kinds of new developments in genetics, artificial intelligence, human genome sequencing, right? So we think those areas are very fruitful. They give us new areas of research, and that's good. Scope. So again, the amount of diverse phenomena that can be explained by the theory. So, right, developments in biology or zoology. The more we understand and the wider the scope, the more robust our explanations are going to be. Okay, simplicity. Here's an Occam's razor joke here for you. As I said, other things being equal, the best theory is the one that is the simplest. That is the one that makes the fewest assumptions. Not necessarily, right? But that's why I said other things being equal. We tend to prefer, for good reasons, simpler explanations. And the theory making the fewest assumptions is less likely to be false because there are fewer ways for it to go wrong, right? So again, the car battery is dead versus the Rick and Morty explanation. In the latter case, we have to make a whole host of assumptions versus the car battery being dead. Many of our potential, candidate theories for car not starting violate this condition. Often people use what are called ad hoc hypotheses. What's an ad hoc hypothesis? This is where we come up with a hypothesis after the fact. So it'd be like, with my bottle example, smashing in the freezer. So it'd be like something like, oh, well, the hypothesis is, Anthony slipped and fell and the bottle shattered in the freezer, right? That's an ad hoc hypothesis. That's not, I'm making it after the fact versus, right, a much more thorough and sustained investigation into why there's shattered glass. So here's a good example of ad hoc hypothesis in action. This is a diagram showing what is called retrograde motion. So if you've taken astronomy or remember high school, this is, right, we have the sun at the center. This is the phenomenon where it appears that planets double back on themselves. So imagine that this is Mars going across the night sky. It actually looks like Mars makes this loop. It goes back on itself and then proceeds. We had a really tough time explaining this, especially before the heliocentric model. So for the longest time, right, many scientists and philosophers thought that the Earth was the center of our solar system, but they had a really tough time making sense of this phenomenon. But once we move to the heliocentric model, we can actually do a much better job of explaining why planets seem to do this. And it has to do with, right, the position of the Earth, its rotation, right? Here's an explanation of retrograde motion pre-heliocentric models. So this is from the great astronomer Ptolemy. He came up with this very elaborate model of the solar system. So you can see here that he thought the way we explain retrograde motion, we have the Earth at the center, which looks straight out, but all the other planets make these kind of weird loops here, right? So this violates our notion of simplicity, because if we have the heliocentric model, it can explain this in a much simpler way than having to postulate these elaborate ellipses or epicycles, right? So that there's an actual scientific example of simplicity in action. And then conservatism. So there's the late, great Carl Sagan, whose claim here I really still use: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So remember that with conspiracy theories. But conservatism is an important point. This criterion says that, other things being equal, the best theory or explanation is the one that fits best with our well-established beliefs. That is, with beliefs backed by excellent evidence or very good arguments. And the more extraordinary the claim or hypothesis is, the more evidence you need to produce. I think Sagan is right. If I'm going to claim that Rick and Morty, if we're in an episode of Rick and Morty, I need to provide some extraordinary evidence to back up that claim. Whereas postulating that the car battery is dead requires a lot less evidence. I mean, it still requires evidence, but if I'm going to make some extraordinary claims, I better back it up with extraordinary evidence. And I think Vaughan is right, and others are right, to include this in any discussion of scientific theories or even conspiracy theories. So a review, right? We've got 5 criteria: testability, fruitfulness, scope, simplicity, and conservatism. So let's use an example. If we were in class together, I'd show you some YouTube videos. Many students haven't heard this, but I think it's a great candidate for applying the criteria of adequacy. For the longest time, people engaged in what's called dowsing. So if you're unfamiliar with dowsing, do a quick search. There's some YouTube videos on it. Most people historically used wooden rods, but these days people use aluminum rods or various kinds of other metal rods. And the idea is that you are able to locate, using these rods, bodies of water or metallic objects. Okay, and some people are very into this. So if you do a search on YouTube, you can find lots of people claiming to be able to teach you how to douse. Okay, so if we applied the criteria of adequacy to dowsing, what would we get? Testability. Well, we can test it, and it fails those tests, right? Many tests have shown that dowsing is no more effective than chance. Is it fruitful? Well, dowsers claim to be able to make novel discoveries of materials, but these are not further applied to other cases. So why does dowsing only work on water, and some people claim oil, but not other objects, right? That's kind of an odd thing relative to other devices that we can use and test. What about the scope? Seems to be pretty limited in scope and doesn't explain the phenomena. Simplicity. Dowsing makes a large number of assumptions about the device, the relationship between the branch and operator, and materials under investigation. You would see that if you look at a YouTube video on dowsing. And dowsing does not fit well with our other well-established scientific findings and theories, especially background knowledge. We have no good reason to believe that dowsing lends itself to the discovery of water or oil or metallic objects in the ground, with everything that we know about how those materials work, right? So that would be a simple example of using the criteria of adequacy on dowsing. Okay, so this leads to the test formula, which is taking the criteria of adequacy and then using it in a more robust way, which we could do with conspiracy theories. So the test formula has a simple number of steps that I think we can use in everyday life, especially with conspiracy theory. 1, what's the theory, right? We got to state the theory and check for consistency. No matter if we're talking about the flat Earth view or some political conspiracies, that the QAnon would be a good example to use here, right? We want to state the theory and see if it's consistent. Most conspiracy theories aren't even consistent. They fail step 1. Step 2, assess the evidence for the theory, right? What is the evidence for the claim or hypothesis? Step 3, what are alternative theories? And then step 4, how do these theories stack up with respect to the criteria of adequacy? Now, again, while not foolproof, the test formula does give us a good way to separate good theories from bad ones. Is it foolproof? No. I mean, but I do think that it's a good set of tools that we can use to not be taken in by conspiracy theories and other illegitimate claims, right? Here's another good example from a few years ago. I don't know if you have heard about this. There's been this raw water phenomena. It's really interesting. If you do a Google search, you'll see what I mean. We could use the test formula on the raw water craze. It's really quite amazing, some of the claims that these raw water proponents make. So the idea very simply is that raw water proponents think that many of them that the water that we have in our public drinking water systems, that things like fluoride are mind control substances. So the idea is that you should drink untreated water instead of public water. You can find some information, but we could use the test method on the raw water case, and I think it would be pretty clear what should come up, right? Testability. We know that unfiltered drinking water leads to serious adverse health effects. The claims by the raw water proponents are either unverified or false. Raw water claims to be able to lead to many health benefits, but these seem rather limited or also false. Scope seems to be limited in scope and doesn't explain phenomena that proponents claim, like fluoride being a mind control substance. Simplicity, raw water proponents' claims do not appear very simple. Other more simple explanations can be given. And raw water does not fit well with other well-established scientific findings and theories, especially background knowledge concerning what we know about the positive health benefits of public water sources and fluoride in particular. So I know I've kind of rushed through this example, but I do think that this test method in the book can be very useful. And again, we might want to add or subtract certain things, but I like these 5 criteria of adequacy. We do talk about these things in relation to science and medicine all the time. And I think it could be used on theories that we see online and from friends and family as well. So let me leave it there just to keep it from going too long. If you have any questions about inference to best explanation or the examples I'm using here, please be sure to reach out to me. Thanks for listening.